Thanks a lot for coming. It's a slightly odd title to this meeting because the question is capitalism broken? It slightly depends what you mean, but I'm assuming most of the people in this room are in their early 20s or so, which means that for most people in this room, not everyone, but for most people in this room, the system has been dealing with the legacy of the crisis since you were 10, 11, 12, or in your early teens. And it's very unusual to have a period in the history of capitalism in which you have a crisis whose effects are so prolonged, so deep, and so fundamentally shape the world we live in as the crisis that we see today. It's now almost a full decade. In fact, it's a full decade since the credit crunch in 2007 that heralded the beginning of this financial crisis, and it's almost 10 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which sent the world economy into a very, very deep recession in 2008. And still today we're living with the legacy of that crisis. And that's why, as Michael Roberts, whose blog some of you may have read from time to time, is right when he talks about the period we're living in as a long depression, to give the title of his latest book. And what I want to try and do in the next 25-30 minutes is explain the roots of that long recession, long depression, to explain the nature of the recovery that's followed from the initial crisis in 2008, and to try to explore the conditions that will be required for the world economy to start booming again, and what it means for working class people living under the system. So that's what the task I've set myself. For those who know me well, you won't be surprised to hear there are some graphs, slides and so on. And I'll show you those in a moment. Let me start by saying, though, that the people who supposedly preside over the capitalist system, I think, are increasingly aware that something fundamentally is broken in the capitalist system. There was a recent analysis by, of the US economy, still the biggest economy in the world, by Wells Fargo, which estimated that the 2008 to 2015 period, during that period, there was an average annual 20% shortfall in fixed capital investment. So the level of investment in machinery, in plant, in equipment and so on was a fifth lower than would have been expected right through that period. The negative impact on GDP in America was something like 10%. A huge blow to the expansion of the world capitalist system. There was a report from the OECD last week which talked about the way in which the economy is actually growing at the fastest rate since the recession took place in 2008, the global recession. But it added, this is a quote, we're living with the lingering effects of prolonged subpar growth after the financial crisis, reflected in investment, trade, productivity and wage growth. At every level, the world economy is underperforming compared to the trajectory before 2008. And it's in that kind of context in which quite leading figures within the establishment are now starting to worry about what's happening. Larry Summers, used to be Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary in the US, talks about a period of secular stagnation. In other words, the world economy being trapped in a new period in which it can merely stagnate. Christine Lagarde, head of the International Monetary Fund, talks about a new mediocre for the world economy. In other words, this is about as good as it gets in the period ahead of us. We have to understand we're in a period which is imposing enormous pressure on the economy, and even the people at the top of the system are worried about what's going on. How do we explain the crisis? I want to start by talking about the crisis in profitability. We can't explain the period we're in without starting from this basic fact. This is from Andrew Kleinman's data for the US economy. I'll show you a couple of the versions of this as well. What this is looking at is the return on investment for US capitalism. So if I invest in plant and equipment and machinery, what kind of return am I getting on my investment? And this is fundamentally important to capitalism. If my return on investment is 20%, if I just squirrel the money away, after 5 years I can double the size of my investment. It's a huge rate of expansion of capitalism. If my rate of profit is 10%, it will take me 10 years. If it drops to 5%, it will take me 20 years, and so on. The whole way in which the capitalist system is able to expand is dictated by this figure. How rapidly can capitalism expand? And if we go back to Marx, here there's some more data. This is from Michael Roberts. That's the one I wanted to show you, though, which is the estimates for the world economy by Esteban Maito. This is for just the core of the system, but this is for the world economy as a whole. You see the same kind of pattern that you see for the US economy. This takes us back to Marx, because Marx argued the fundamental roots of crisis lie in a long-term tendency for profitability to decline within the capitalist system. About long-term decline in profitability, which you see very clearly in the period from here just after the war through to about 1982, that decline in profitability sometimes impinges upon the thinking of mainstream economists as well. There was a column in the Financial Times in 2010 which pointed out that the return on investment in the US was around 15% in the post-war period by their figures, 10% in 1980s, and 5% in the current period. And they note in the article, few would put money at risk for that reward. If profit rates drop to a low enough level, of course people are not going to invest because the return on investment simply doesn't justify the investment. So some mainstream thinkers occasionally talk about this data. What they can't do, though, is explain why this happens. And Marx put forwards in his work Capital, written mainly in the 1860s, long time ago, put forwards an explanation. And I don't want to go into the detail of the explanation. If people are interested, they can read my book, Unravelling Capitalism, or there's various other books which explain this. But the fundamental reason that Marx pointed to was Marx argued that the profit generated by the capitalist system is at the most basic level squeezed out of working class people. It's fundamentally based on the gap between the new wealth created by what he called living labour, the toil of working class people, and the money received by working class people when they take home their pay. And the basic functioning of capitalism is this. A working class person does 8 hours or 10 hours of work during a working day, but they take home enough value to cover 4 or 5 hours of that. And the remainder of the working day, they're working to enrich the capitalist. That's a fundamental argument that Marx makes in Capital. That whole process of exploitation, at one level, is no different from exploitation that happened in previous forms of society, whether it's the feudalism of medieval Europe, whether it's ancient Greece or ancient Rome. The difference under capitalism is that process is hidden behind a wage packet. If you manage to cover the cost of your wage in 4 hours of work, the capitalist doesn't come and tap you on the shoulder and say, well, you've covered your wage now you're working purely to enrich me. That will never happen in a capitalist workplace. The process of exploitation is hidden, but Marx argues it's nonetheless a real process. And indeed, all of the profits generated by capitalism through capitalist production are pumped out of 2 billion wage labourers who exist now on a global scale. But Marx adds a second part to his argument. He says that there's another form of investment, not in living labour, not in the labour of working class people, but in what he calls dead labour. Investment in machinery, in plant and equipment. And Marx argues that this form of investment was produced by workers in the past, because ultimately all machinery, all raw material comes from human labour at its most basic and fundamental level. But this dead labour, which is bought by a capitalist, is neither a source of profit nor loss for the capitalist. It constitutes a value that is obtained by the capitalist when they spend their money on their investment, and it passes through into the final product and is sold on to the person who buys that product. There's neither a profit nor a loss on dead labour for the system as a whole. Living labour is a source of profit, Marx argues. And what Marx claims in the third volume of Capital, is that over long periods of time, investment in dead labour will outweigh investment in living labour. And that's the fundamental reason why the rate of profit falls. A greater and greater mass of investment is chasing a profit squeeze, a limited amount of profit squeezed out of 2 billion wage labourers on a global scale. And if that's true, if you have more and more investment chasing a fixed amount of profit, or a gradually growing amount of profit, but growing much less rapidly than the level of investment, of course profit rates are going to fall in the long run. So that's Marx's argument. The third and final part of that argument is that this process of investing more and more to get a certain return is a compulsory process under capitalism. The capitalist has no choice about doing this. The consequence if you fail to invest is you get driven out of business. And that's very, very logical if you think about it. You think about any car manufacturer, for example, trying to produce cars using the technology of 50 or 60 years ago, immediately they'll be driven to the wall. They'll be driven out of business. You simply can't survive as a capitalist unless you take some profits and plough them back into your workplace in the form of investment. So this endless process of investment to try and grab more profit goes on under capitalism. The net result of this is this long-term fall in profitability. And I want to argue that the crisis that we've witnessed, I'll go back to the earlier graph because it's a little bit clearer, the crisis we're witnessing is a result of this long-term decline in profitability. Now I want to now try and address some of the questions that come up when you start to look at capitalism in this way. The first point is an obvious one. If you look at this graph, profits fall until 1982. Surely the crisis should have come in 1982, not in 2008. And that's a very, very important question we have to address. What happens when the rate of profit falls? Now, there were a whole series of crises. There was a major crisis in 1981. So there were crises in this period, right through the 1970s and so on. Low profitability has a number of impacts. It slows the level of investment because if you're not going to get a return on your investment, why invest? It puts pressure on the workings of capitalism generally, intensifies all the tensions within the system. And there was indeed a process of intense class struggle in the 1970s and a period of crisis in the 70s and early 80s. However, when capitalism was able to survive the crisis of the 70s and early 80s, for reasons I'm going to talk about in a moment, there was no restoration of profitability. The world economy remained trapped from 1982 onwards in this period of grindingly low profitability levels. And faced with that low profitability, the temptation for capitalists was not to invest in the bits of the economy producing goods and services, was to look for other areas of investment outside the goods and services producing areas of the economy. And I've got a graph which shows you what happens. This is what happens. This is US financial assets as a percentage of GDP. And this is the period we're talking about, this period from here to here. An absolutely colossal growth in financial assets. An enormous growth in credit, a growth for a time in stock markets, a growth in a whole series of assets. I mean, you think about today, people are talking about bitcoins going up to $10,000 for a bitcoin, up from a few hundred a couple of years ago. This is a huge, huge episode of speculation. But what we've seen since 1982 onwards is a whole series of speculative bubbles begin to develop in the economy as people chase after a profit independent of the real goods and services producing sectors of the economy. So the period of low profitability has been a period of financialization, of financial and debt growth. And that huge growth of credit and finance has persisted right through the crisis. That period hasn't been reversed. just a little bit of data showing for different sections of the world economy the way in which credit, which is at huge levels even in 2007, I remember when the crisis broke in 2007, lots of Keynesians and people believed this was a period in which we could tame finance. Finance has not been tamed. Finance, debt, credit has continued to expand right through the period, particularly in what are called emerging markets. That's why when the crisis breaks in 2007, 2008, it manifests itself first and foremost as a crisis in the financial system. Where does the crisis break? It breaks in the US housing market, a hugely speculative area of the economy. But unless we understand the underlying problem of profitability, we can't understand why that deep financial crisis that broke in 2007, 2008 mutated into a global recession, and why that recession has had an impact that's lasted for an entire decade, far longer than most crises continue to have an impact. It's rooted in the low profitability right through the period. The second qualification to this picture of low profitability, people often say, well, is Marx saying that profits will just drop like a stone all the time under capitalism? That's not what Marx argues. If you read the third volume of Capital, Marx argues there's a law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but there's also what he calls counteracting tendencies that tend to push profitability upwards. The most obvious one is that the cost of your investment is falling over time. As price cutting takes place, it's a competitive capitalist economy, there'll be some reduction in the costs of fixed capital, and that will slightly elevate profitability in the short run. Secondly, very important for the current period, you can squeeze workers harder. You can exploit people more. If you go from a situation in which workers make back their wage packet in 4 or 5 hours of work to a period in which they make their wages back in 3 or 4 hours of work because you cut their wages, more is left over for the capitalist. And one way of looking at the whole period from 1980 is as a period in which the ruling class have imposed more and more pressure on working class people to try to put a floor under their profitability and try to hold them at a certain level. So there's all kinds of factors that come into play that can stop profit rates falling. In other words, it's a long-term tendency, but it's not a simple pattern. But what Marx argues is that if you want to fundamentally restore profitability in a really big way, what you have to have is you have to have a major capitalist crisis. What happens in crisis? Two things happen in crisis. The first thing that happens in crisis is that all of the previous investment that's happened over the capitalist system is depreciated, falls in value. I'll give you an example. Right at the beginning of the crisis, Woolworths, a venerable London UK brand, Woolworths went bust. Companies existed for decades. And the entirety of Woolworths was sold for £10. Now, it had some debts as well. It wasn't quite as good a deal as that. One of us could go and buy Woolworths for £10. Lots of pick and mix and all kinds of crap in Woolworths. But nonetheless, it was a bargain. And if you get your hands on that on Woolworths for £10 plus some debt, but at a fraction of its real value, you're getting your hands on a mass of productive investment, of infrastructure, of depots, of unsold goods and so on, at a fraction of their real value. And the boost to profitability is enormous. Now imagine that process of depreciation taking place across an entire economy because there's a slump, because businesses are failing all over the place. Banks are collapsing, so debts get written off. Goods are dumped on the market at fire sale costs, and so on. These kind of processes and the destructions of firms which create space in the market for new firms to arise, these kind of destructive processes pave the way for a boom. This is how you explain why profitability is so high in the post-war period. Because the period from 1929 right through to 1945 is a period of slump, of depression, and of huge destruction. Destruction in crisis, followed by destruction in war, the Second World War. And at the end of that process, all of that productive investment is handed back to the bits that are taken on by the state, handed back to capitalists at a fraction of their real value. You have this enormous boost in profitability. So what went wrong in 1982, or 1975, when the earlier crises broke? What Marx would argue is that those crises were not on a big enough scale to restore profitability. And if we want to understand why this is, we have to look at how capitalism has changed. These are my own calculations. But they're just looking, again, this is the US economy data. It's looking at the scale of concentration of capital. If you look at the world of capitalism today, the world of capitalism today is not a world of small, footloose companies, whatever people tell you. It's a world of massive, massive corporations. It's a world in which Walmart, the biggest corporation in the world, has an annual turnover the same as the GDP of Norway. It's a world of giant firms. And these giant firms pose a problem for capitalism. Not only are they massive in their own terms, but they're deeply entwined with the state. They're deeply entwined with the state system, and they're deeply embedded in the financial system. You take companies like General Motors and Ford, these are not just producers of cars, these are now producers of finance. Most of the business of General Motors is in car financing. They're heavily embedded in the financial system, they're linked together. One of these giant firms goes under, the impact on the capitalist system can be colossal. And therefore the temptation of the people who run the capitalist state is to bail out firms. It's to stop the process of crisis taking hold of the capitalist system and keep the system driving forwards, even at the price of paving the way for a new crash. In 2001 there was a recession in America. There's a famous quote from Ben Bernanke, who's running the Fed at that time, who says, "This sucker could go down." What do? They slash interest rates and stimulate a housing bubble. What is it that goes bust in 2007? The housing bubble. Okay? So the temptation is to bail out the system, keep it driving forwards by any means necessary. That's what we're seeing still today. We're seeing this what I call, following Mike Kidron, a great economist who was in the early SWP, sclerotic capitalism. Capitalism that's so bloated, clogged up and so on, it can't effectively clear itself out. And right through this period you see this stagnation of profitability and a failure of profitability to rebound. Okay, how am I doing for time?
You've got about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, fine. Is this then a final crisis of capitalism? Absolutely not. The great revolutionary Lenin said there is no final crisis of capitalism, provided working class people are prepared to pay the price. Capitalism, of course, will continue. My argument is not that capitalism is about to collapse. The only sense in which capitalism might face a final crisis is if, ecological devastation makes it impossible for humans to live on the planet or something like that, or we regress to a state of barbarism or something like that. But in the short term, this is not a final crisis for capitalism. What we're arguing is that if we're going to see another boom of capitalism, if we're going to see the system restored to its full health, there is going to have to be a much longer, more substantial clearing out of the system, causing enormous disruption to working class lives, enormous dislocation of the political system, enormous tension between different states as they fight over who will pay the cost for the crisis. All of the tension in the capitalist system will be exacerbated in this period. In other words, we're facing a long period of crisis. We're not facing a small crisis, we're facing a whole period of crisis ahead of us. The final point about the general situation before I talk about the way forward. People often say, well, what about China? It's all very well to talk about the US economy and Europe and the old capitalist states. What about these newly rising capitalist states? And what you get if you look at China in particular, but it's true of other states as well, is you get the other side of this picture of crisis. If you look at the Chinese economy, now the second biggest economy in the world, the huge boom of the Chinese economy was based fundamentally on high levels of exploitation of workers, very, very high levels of exploitation of workers, but also incredible levels of investment. Fully half of the output of the Chinese economy was reinvested in fixed capital at the height of the boom. I know of no other economy anywhere in the world, anywhere in history, that has reinvested so much of its output. Much of this directed towards export markets. Now, after 2007, 2008, those export markets begin drying up. What does the Chinese state do in this situation? It can't guarantee the level of profitability on its investment. It's facing what Marx would call a crisis of overaccumulation. Again, too much investment chasing limited pools of profit. It can't expand into external economies. What does the Chinese state do? It unleashes a wave of credit. A massive expansion of credit. And this explains, it helps to explain this data here. If you look at the growth of debt in the emerging economies, this is only up to 2013. It's grown a lot more since then. In the period since the crisis, more than 100% of Chinese GDP credit has expanded by more than 100% of a year's output in China. A huge wave of credit to continue driving the Chinese economy forwards. And on the basis of that credit, you get a couple of things happening. The first is that there is a mass of non-performing investment in China. Huge investments which have never turned a profit and probably never will turn a profit. And it's reflected in the landscape of China. If you look at China, there are huge cities that have been built with no one living in them. Just empty cities built of skyscrapers, waiting for people to move into them. You look at the airports, there are more airports than they could possibly need in China. A massive investment has taken place, some of it which will never be profitable. Secondly, the fragility of the Chinese financial system. The Chinese banking system today is bigger than the banking system across the entirety of the Eurozone. And that's something that's happened almost overnight in China. And you begin to see today, when there are as it opens up to global capital markets, when there are fluctuations in the Chinese stock market, it has an impact globally, something that just wouldn't have been true 10 or 15 years ago. So even the Chinese economy, one of the most successful economies, can't exempt itself from the pressure of this global crisis. Now, the Chinese economy is still growing at levels that, Hammond would sell his grandmother to get those kind of levels of growth. But I'm not saying that it's all going to come crashing down straight away, but don't ignore the pressure on the Chinese economy and the knock-on pressure that has on economies like Brazil, some of the sub-Saharan African economies that have redirected their exports to direct them towards the Chinese boom. And Brazil has entered a very deep recession a couple of years ago, partly as a response to this. Okay, a few minutes on the response to the crisis. The response to the crisis in 2007-2008 is this. Sorry, there are a lot of graphs. I'm sorry if you don't like graphs, but you just have to bear with me. I like graphs.
They like you.
They like me, yeah. The response was a form of bailout by the ruling classes around the world, but it was a financialised bailout. What I mean by that is it wasn't necessarily... They rescued some firms, big motor firms in America, banks around the world were bailed out and so on. But the key form that the bailout has taken is a financialised bailout. Policy rates of interest. What's the interest rate? The interest rate has dropped to zero across many of the advanced economies, and in some economies it's negative now. Negative interest rates. I remember when I was a kid, I tried to get my parents to explain, how is it I put money in the bank and they give me more money, this is magical. And it took me years to understand the interest rates. And then you hear about negative interest rates and you think, everything my parents told me was a lie. If you're a bank in Switzerland and you lend money to a central bank, they will pay you will pay them for the privilege of lending them money. And they will pay you to borrow from them. There's a topsy-turvy world of capitalism, but this is what it took to get the system moving again. The other side of it, which is captured in this graph, is quantitative easing. Essentially generating money temporarily, using that to buy banking assets, bonds and so on, flooding the banks with liquidity, with cash, and hoping that the banks will then lend that money on to other people, and simultaneously helping to drive down borrowing rates and so on. Now, these measures, this financialised bailout, partially helped to stabilise the system. One of the things that's happened is that we have a world today in which you have large numbers of companies sitting on cash piles. You know, there's very profitable companies still. They're sitting on cash that they don't invest. Apple and so on have massive reserves of cash. They don't invest it. Yeah, 5 minutes, cool. On the other hand, you have zombie companies. I was for a while the treasurer of the SWP, and every few months I'd get a letter from some financial firm saying, why don't you borrow some money from us? Really low interest rates. It's almost impossible. We didn't borrow the money, by the way. I was a very prudent treasurer of the SWP. But it was very hard to go out of business. It was very hard to go out of business if you can borrow at low interest rates. So you have zombie companies that just about keep ticking over, servicing their debt, but they never really make major investments. People talk all the time about the productivity crisis. Why is there a productivity crisis? Because if you want to drive, productivity is how much value you generate per hour per worker, by the way. How do you drive that up? Well, you invest. You get better machinery, you get better technology, you drive the process of production forward. That's not happening. Productivity in Britain has flatlined since the recession. It's one of the big problems that the Chancellor faces is this productivity crisis in Britain. So that's one side of the response to a crisis. The other side is, what do you do if you're a bank and you're awash with cash, but actually no one is really investing in the real economy? Well, you have to find some outlet for this cash. And so there's been, over the last 10 years or so, what's sometimes called a search for yield, as people have scoured the globe looking for investments that are risky enough that they turn a decent profit. You know, Rwandan government debt. The first issue of Rwandan government debt, massively oversubscribed. Not a very safe bet. But if you're awash with cash, you want risky bets because you want to turn a profit. Bitcoin, you could argue, is part of this process. People search for risky investments, and it ploughs into economies, particularly in the global south. You've seen liquidity flow into these economies. What we're now seeing is a moment of crisis, a moment of great concern for the global economy, because they're trying to switch off the life support machine. And we don't know if the patient will survive without it. In America, they're beginning to crank up interest rates. Quantitative easing is gradually being shut down. As this happens, money flows out of these economies in the global south, and you get panic in these markets. As this happens, firms that have been ticking over begin to go bankrupt. And you saw last year the beginnings of a big spike in bankruptcy, bond defaults and so on, as this medicine that's kept the economy going is gradually withdrawn. It's a very risky period, in other words, for the ruling class. Okay, final point I want to make is really about what we say about this, and I'll finish on this point. One of the arguments you hear very commonly on the left, and it's probably the common sense inside the Labour Party under Corbyn and McDonnell, is that the crisis in 2007-2008 is a crisis of underconsumption. People weren't consuming enough, and therefore the economy went into crisis. And therefore the solution is essentially a Keynesian solution, that we drive up demand by the state spending money. And that will get the economy going. I think we have to reject that analysis. The global capitalist economy can go into crisis when spending is going up, as it did in the 1970s, or when spending is stable, as it was in 2007-2008. In the 1970s, the argument was it's a wage squeeze crisis. Wages are too high, so we get a crisis. People say in 2008 wages were too low. This is not the fundamental factor. The fundamental factor is a fall in profitability. We have to start from that basic fact. So the Keynesian prescription can't really explain where the crisis came from. Does Keynesianism give a solution to the crisis? I would like to argue that it's not really a solution to the crisis, or certainly not one that we on the left should get behind in an unequivocal way. If the state is going to spend money to get the economy going, we have to ask, where does that money come from? Maybe that money comes from capitalist profits. That's good, I'm in favour of taking profits off the capitalists. But we shouldn't think that's going to actually restore a capitalist economy to health. Taking money off the capitalists will further undermine profitability. So in capitalist terms, that doesn't make any sense. Or the money can come from workers. Well, okay, we can take money from the workers and get the economy going. That's not a solution the left can possibly advocate. We're not in favour of taking money off the workers. Or the money can come through borrowing, which is fine up to a point. But ultimately, do we want to continue to feed this process of financialisation and credit growth that's made capitalism so unstable? I don't think that the Keynesian alternative is a coherent one. Does that mean that we're in favour of austerity and the opposite of Keynesianism, if you like? Absolutely not. Often we will agree with John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn when they say they want to spend more. The difference is that we don't advocate these measures on the basis that this is a way to rescue the capitalist system. Our job is not to rescue the capitalist system, comrades. Our job is to challenge and ultimately to overthrow the capitalist system. So we come at the problem in a very different way, and I want to finish with one of the great revolutionaries, Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg wrote a fantastic pamphlet called Reform and Revolution. And in it she said, you know, revolutionaries have to be serious about fighting for reforms. Of course we do. But the way we envisage reforms, the way we fight for reforms is fundamentally different to the way that reformist leaders advocate and fight for reforms. First of all, we fight for reforms regardless of whether they actually strengthen the capitalist system. We fight for reforms to defend working class people. Secondly, we fight for reforms using militant methods, both because they're the most effective methods to win reforms, but also because every reform that's won, that is wrested from the capitalist class through struggle from below strengthens the working class movement and puts us in a stronger position to wrest further gains from them in the future and ultimately to challenge and overthrow the whole barbaric system. We need to learn from Rosa Luxemburg that we will sometimes agree with the Keynesians about defending working class communities, increasing social spending, and so on and so forth. But the way that we advocate that is not through saying that some government is going to do that on our behalf, but by saying that working class people themselves have to go out and fight collectively for these things, both in order to win these things most effectively and securely, but also to pave the way for wider battles in which we begin to challenge this barbaric, profit-driven and failed capitalist system. Thank you.